On a night when London's fog lay in sheets so dense that the gas lamps were but pale coins pressed into a woolen sky, a hansom rattled to a halt before the familiar steps of Baker Street. The driver's boots struck sparks on the curb as he sprang down, and a young footman, powdered with frost, thrust open our door with an agitation that needed no announcement. Dr. Watson observed, though he would never have said so aloud, that even Mrs. Hudson's good sense faltered at the sight of the liveried messenger shaking a sealed envelope as though it burned his fingers. Holmes did not rise from his violin. He drew the bow across the strings with a delicacy that made the room vibrate, then arrested the note as cleanly as a throat cut. "From Belgravia," he said, regarding the smut-spattered shoes of the footman. "Your master keeps a house in Eaton Place. He is an early riser with a German cook, and you have come by way of Knightsbridge rather than Piccadilly." The footman gaped. "Sir, how—" "The soot is from the shorter Knightsbridge route," Holmes replied, breaking the seal. "Our hands of the city leave fingerprints if one only cares to look." He read, and the mocking light withdrew from his eyes, leaving them as keen and cold as the air beyond the window. "Watson," he said, "put on your coat. There is death in a drawing-room and no footmarks in the approach." The note, penned in the austere hand of Inspector Lestrade, was brief and dreadful. Sir Alister Chiswick, philanthropist and patron of the arts, had been found in his music-room not an hour since, collapsed upon the parquet, his face touched with an ashen hue that no physician could ascribe to the ordinary offices of apoplexy. The doors had been locked upon the inside, the windows were latched and limned with undisturbed frost. The servants swore that neither friend nor foe had passed the threshold. Yet there, upon the shining boards, lay a figure that had danced, so Lestrade wrote, its last. "It is that phrase which arrests me," Holmes murmured as we jolted through the murk. "The fatality is commonplace, the circumstances less so, but the turn of the description had danced its last is altogether peculiar in a policeman's pen." "You think Lestrade careless in his words?" Watson's regard for the inspector's stubborn pluck did not blind him to the man's poverty of imagination. "Not careless, no," Holmes returned. "Merely truthful without understanding his truth. He has seen something that suggests a dance. The human eye keeps a ledger of impressions the mind has not yet learned to read." The Chiswick house stood sentinel in a corner of Eaton Place, its brick facade pale as a buried bone. We were admitted by a grave-faced butler who gave his name as Hargreaves and his manner as unassailable respectability. Yet even he bit his lip when he spoke of his master. "A good man, sir, stern to idleness, kind to zeal. He returned this evening from rehearsal at the Adelphi, bade me see that the gramophone was set in order, and asked for the latest post. That was at 8:45. At 10 minutes to 11, Lady Chiswick requested, I see why the music had ceased to change. I found the door fastened from within." "And you forced it?" asked Holmes. "By order of her ladyship. Collins the footman and I put a shoulder to it. Sir Alister was upon the floor." Hargreaves swallowed. It looked as if, that is to say, his slippers were. There was a curious— "Take me," said Holmes. He made no show of sympathy, and yet, to Watson's eye, there was a gentler cadence in the short command. We passed through a corridor where portraits of powdered ancestors regarded us with the flat, wise stare of the long dead, and into a chamber in whose heart the mystery of the night sat enthroned. It was a handsome room, panelled in dark wood, with a grand piano under a shawl of velvet, and a gramophone by the window whose horn flared like a bronze flower. The air held the faint tang of coal gas and the more domestic odour of beeswax. The fire in the grate had been banked, On a central table lay a metronome, its lacquer blistered in one neat crescent, as if touched by a momentary flame. A music folio, embossed with the title Waltz of the Ashen Hour, had fallen half open to a page where penciled numbers marched among the printed notes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like footsteps drilled into obedience. Sir Alistair lay upon his back, his limbs not sprawled but composed, as though the hand that had stilled him were considerate of appearances. What at once and irresistibly seized the attention was the pattern under and about his feet. The parquet, usually the pride of a city house, was dusted with small islands of grey, each the size of a shilling, arranged in pairs and turns with measured intervals between. In the bright spill of the chandelier they mapped a figure, not random spatter, but intention. The ash had kissed his slippers and smudged the cuffs of his dressing gown, so that he seemed a man who had waltzed through a long snowfall. Lestrade stood guard with 2 constables, his face carved in frustration. "There you are, Mr. Holmes. Locked room, no struggle, no wound, and that damn nonsense on the floor. I've sent for the divisional surgeon, but he'll only tell me what I already know, that the gentleman is beyond any help we can give him." Holmes lifted the metronome, turned it once, as a jeweller will consider a gem, and set it down without a word. He stooped to the gramophone, pressed his finger to the record's edge, and listened to the faintest rasp, as of breath caught in the throat of a machine. "It sticks upon the same bar," he said. "See, here the needle wears a bright groove where it has worried the wax. How many times, Hargreaves, did you wind the instrument for your master?" "Twice, sir," said the butler, his hands tight upon themselves. He liked the same piece over until he had it by heart. "Liked," corrected Holmes, softly, without a hint of cruelty. He surveyed the ash pattern again. "Inspector, tell me what you see." "I see that someone has scattered ash about on purpose to make us think, what? That a phantom danced him to death?" Lestrade snorted. "The fire's been light, but the coal bucket's full, and yet all that ash. You'll say it's from some special cigar, no doubt, and produce a lecture." Holmes's lips curved. "You flatter me by expecting my monograph. Tobacco ash is the handwriting of indulgence, but this—" he knelt and touched one grey island with the end of a quill, "is not the signature of any cigar in Christendom. It is finer than the white ash of a Trichinopoli without the feathering one sees in an Egyptian. It lacks the black flakes of our clay-pipe devotees. There is a dry, mineral fineness as of sifted residue from a laboratory furnace." "Coal dust?" Watson ventured. "Not coal. Coal is a coarse and sooty fellow. This is a fastidious powder." His nostrils flared. "And there is a faint bitterness, not almond. Banish that popular fancy of cyanide. Something more like, quinine's sober cousin." He glanced up, swift as a hawk. "Has the body been moved?" "Only enough to confirm he was gone," Lestrade said. "No marks, no bruising, Doctor?" He looked to Watson, who knelt and made his examination with the practised economy of a man who has learned that appearances may lie. "There is no contusion that I can discover," Watson said presently. "The pupils are, yes, sluggish, but not fixed in the way I have seen with certain vegetable poisons. The lips are hardly discoloured, the jaw is a trifle stiff, yet the general relaxation suggests a quiet end." A rustle at the doorway announced Lady Chiswick, her face pale under a diadem of jet. "Gentlemen," she managed, "if there is anything I can—" Her composure trembled and returned. "My husband had no enemies that I knew of. He was exacting in his patronage, but generous. Tonight's rehearsal concerned a charity concert. The piece, you see," she gestured to the folio, "was to be its centrepiece, a new waltz. He bought the manuscript last week." "From whom?" Holmes asked without looking at her. A young composer, Miss Elise Varley. She is most talented. Mr. Victor Kahn, the impresario, introduced them. Ah, said Holmes softly, art, ambition, and money, a triple measure that can turn any ballroom into a battlefield. He nodded toward the ash. Did your husband suffer from nerves? Did he pace and rehearse his steps? He did, Mr. Holmes. He was fond of dancing, and when he prepared for performance, he would mark positions on the floor. Chalk, usually, not this. Her voice faltered upon the last word. Chalk is the costume of rehearsal, said Holmes. Ash is its morning coat. There was a hush. Even Lestrade, who had little patience for drama, could not at once break it. Holmes's eyes had taken on that distant look Watson knew as the sign of engines turning in his mind. He sat upon the piano stool and, with one finger, tapped out the first bars of the printed waltz, hesitant at first, then sure. 1, 2, 3, he murmured. 1, 2, 3. He rose, placed his feet upon the nearest grey islands, and made a single precise turn. Where his heel lifted, a perfect crescent showed in the ash, thin as the smile of a conniving moon. It is not, Lestrade, that someone danced here, he said. It is that someone taught him where to place his feet. For what purpose? Holmes lifted the blistered metronome once more and held it near the chandelier. In that light, the neat crescent of damage was unmistakable. To keep time, he said, and perhaps to keep silence. The strangest music is not heard with the ears. He set the instrument down and turned to Lady Chiswick with grave courtesy. Madam, forgive me the necessities of my trade. I must ask for the names of all who were in or near this room tonight. Yourself, your husband's valet, the footman Collins, Mr. Kahn, if he called, Miss Varley, if she visited, and anyone else upon whom the waltz has laid its spell. Lady Chiswick's breath caught upon a name. There was also Mr. Otto Drexler, she said, a critic of some influence. He and my husband quarrelled last month over a review. Tonight he sent a note of reconciliation. My husband read it before he shut himself in. Holmes's gaze sharpened as if he had sighted a distant lamp through fog. Yes, he said, more to himself than to us. A reconciliation at the 11th hour, a locked room, a lesson laid out in ash. Inspector, you were right to write that our victim danced his last. The hands that guided him were not those of mercy. Lestrade bristled. And whose hands were they, then? Holmes smiled without warmth. At present I can only tell you this. The waltz is not over. It has merely paused on a repeat. He glanced at Watson. We stay, my dear fellow. There is more in this room than its furniture, and the night will not be wasted on sleep. Holmes remained motionless beside the gramophone, long after the others had withdrawn, his profile cast in long shadow by the flickering chandelier. Watson watched the familiar narrowing of his friend's eyes, the pulse of his concentration visible only in the faint drumming of his fingertips on the table's edge. The inspector shifted impatiently, boots creaking on the parquet. If you've a theory, Mr. Holmes, I'd be glad to hear it before the night grows old. Holmes did not answer at once. He stepped closer to the body and leaned down until his nose was scarcely an inch from the victim's sleeve. Watson, he said softly, what strikes you as curious about the colour of the ash here, this particular patch near the cuff? Watson crouched beside him. It's paler than the rest, almost silver-grey rather than white, as if it had cooled unevenly. Precisely, said Holmes. It suggests heat applied not from the hearth, but from something portable and controlled. The pattern, you observe, grows denser near the hands and feet, suggesting that the ash fell while he moved, not after. Lestrade scowled. Are you saying someone sprinkled it while he was alive? Holmes smiled faintly. I'm suggesting, Inspector, that the ash did not come to the man, it came from him. Or to be precise, from something in his possession. He turned toward the metronome and drew from his pocket a small magnifying lens. You see, this blister upon the side is not from mere flame, it's from intense, focused heat. Something chemical. He lifted the lid from the metronome, revealing an intricate interior of brass and springs. Nestled inside, near the pendulum's pivot, was a tiny vial no larger than a thimble. The cork was half melted. A thin thread of powder trailed from the opening. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, a mechanism to regulate tempo perhaps, but also a vessel for dispersion. Ingenious. Lestrade took a step back. You mean poison? Not poison in the ordinary sense, said Holmes. No odour of almonds, no telltale rash of strychnine or belladonna. Something subtler, vapour perhaps. The ash is the residue of combustion, not the substance itself. He stood abruptly and crossed to the piano, examining the keys with his fingertips. Watson, you recall my monograph on the uses of electrical ignition in chemical devices? Watson smiled faintly. Vividly, Holmes. You nearly set fire to my medical bag. Holmes ignored the memory. Observe, the brass pedal bears a faint scorch, the same crescent we saw upon the metronome. If our victim pressed it, yes, just so, it would complete a circuit. The heat would release a volatile compound, perhaps chloroform in crystallized form, which when ignited would yield these ashes. But why, my dear Watson, would a man willingly activate such a device? Lestrade rubbed his temple. He wouldn't, unless someone tricked him into it. Exactly, Holmes murmured. Lady Chiswick spoke of a new composition, the waltz of the Ashen Hour, purchased only last week. If the waltz were altered in some manner, perhaps with hidden instructions, or a signal known only to its composer, our unfortunate gentleman might have followed the sequence without knowing its consequence. Watson frowned. You believe the waltz itself was a trap? Holmes straightened. A trap set by intellect, not impulse. Each step he took corresponded to the notes, each movement precise, rehearsed. And when the dance reached its final bar, the mechanism completed its fatal design. There was silence except for the slow ticking of the clock on the mantel. Lestrade exhaled sharply. We'll need the names of everyone who handled that music. I'll have a constable fetch Miss Varley at once. Holmes raised a hand. No, Inspector. To summon her tonight would be folly. The guilty expect pursuit, the innocent fear it. Let both rest uneasy a little longer. Meanwhile, we must verify whether this apparatus is indeed of her making. He beckoned Watson closer and produced his penknife. A delicate operation, my dear fellow. Hold the candle steady. With surgeon-like precision, he loosened the screws beneath the metronome's base. Inside, coiled around the mechanism, lay a fine wire connected to a thin copper plate, and beneath that the residue of a white crystalline dust. Mercury fulminate, Holmes whispered, an explosive igniter of remarkable subtlety. Whoever constructed this possessed both musical knowledge and a chemist's hand. Lestrade's face hardened. That settles it, then. A woman composer, dabbling in chemicals? Unlikely. Must have been that critic, Drexler, you said. Germans know their powders. Holmes shook his head. You leap as ever, Inspector. The critic may have motive, but not necessarily means. We require proof, not prejudice. He wrapped the device carefully in his handkerchief and placed it within his pocket. We shall take this to Baker Street in the morning. My own equipment will confirm what we suspect. As they left the room, Lady Chiswick stood at the foot of the stair, a black shawl drawn about her shoulders. Mr. Holmes, she said faintly, Is there hope that you will find who did this?" Holmes bowed slightly. "Madam, I cannot promise hope, only the truth, and the truth, alas, is rarely merciful." Her eyes glistened, but she said no more. The butler ushered them out into the brittle night. The fog had thickened, curling about the gas lamps like grey serpents. As they stepped into the cab, Watson glanced back at the house, its windows shuttered, its music silenced. "Holmes," he said quietly, "you spoke earlier of the waltz not being over. Do you mean to say there will be another death?" Holmes lit his pipe, the flame illuminating his angular features for an instant before vanishing into the gloom. "Perhaps not another death, Watson," he murmured, "but certainly another performance. Whoever composed this dance will not rest until their melody reaches its crescendo. We must learn their rhythm before the final bar is struck." The following morning broke with a raw wind clawing through Baker Street, rattling the panes and whistling down the chimney. Holmes had not slept. When Watson entered the sitting-room, he found his companion bent over the dissected remains of the metronome, a dozen vials and instruments scattered about the table, and a thin spiral of bluish smoke rising from the spirit lamp. Holmes greeted him with the energy of a man whose mind had been well fed, though his body starved. "Ah, Watson, your timing is impeccable. I have just concluded a most illuminating series of tests. Observe." He indicated a glass slide upon which a residue of pale ash shimmered faintly. "You recall my suspicion that our mysterious waltz involved combustion of a chemical nature. This powder, when exposed to a trace of moisture, releases vapor laced with mercury and chloroform compounds, a mixture designed not to kill instantly, but to numb, distort balance, and ultimately suffocate if inhaled for long enough." Watson leaned closer. "And Sir Alistair may have breathed his death as he danced." "Precisely." Holmes's eyes shone. He would have grown faint, his coordination impaired, but the rhythm compelled him to continue. Step after step, inhalation after inhalation, until his heart surrendered. There lies the brilliance. No struggle, no mark, no sound. Death disguised as art. Watson exhaled slowly. "A ghastly poetry, Holmes." "Indeed. Yet poetry seldom writes itself." Holmes turned to the window. "Some mind composed both the melody and the mechanism. We must find the author before another composition is performed." A sharp rap sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, flustered. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a young lady below. Says she's expected, Miss Elise Varley." Holmes's brows lifted. "The composer herself. Show her up, if you please." Moments later, the door opened to reveal a slender woman in a dove-grey coat, her hands trembling slightly as she removed her gloves. Her face was pale but intelligent, framed by dark hair pinned with careless haste. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for receiving me. I heard about Sir Alistair. The papers already whispered dreadful things." Holmes gestured for her to sit. "Then you know why you are here, Miss Varley. Your composition, The Waltz of the Ashen Hour, has achieved a notoriety you could hardly have foreseen." She flinched at the title. "That waltz was never meant for harm, I swear it. I wrote it for emotion, not tragedy." Holmes's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "Emotion and tragedy often share a stage. May I ask how Sir Alistair came to possess the manuscript?" "I sold it through Mr. Victor Khan," she replied, clasping her hands. "He commissions new works for private salons. Sir Alistair admired my earlier pieces and asked for something melancholy, something that captured the passing of splendour into dust, as he phrased it." Holmes's expression sharpened. "An interesting request. Did you deliver the sheet directly to him?" "No, Mr. Khan collected it and said he would make copies for the orchestra." Her gaze flickered uneasily. Is it true the music was found beside him? Holmes inclined his head. It was, along with a metronome altered by a chemist's hand. You have no knowledge of such apparatus? None, she said quickly. I am a musician, not a scientist. My only acquaintance with chemistry is that I once set my sleeve alight with varnish. Watson noted her distress, but Holmes seemed to study it as one might study light through glass, seeking what it revealed rather than what it concealed. Then perhaps you can explain this. He handed her the ash-patterned score, which he had retrieved from the night before. You see these faint graphite markings, tiny numbers penciled beside the bars. She examined it, confusion furrowing her brow. These are not mine. I mark only tempo and phrasing. These numbers mean nothing to me. Yet they form a sequence, said Holmes. 3, 5, 7, 11, prime numbers, you observe, Watson. Hardly the whim of a careless copyist. A code, perhaps, inserted after your hand left the page. Miss Varley's eyes widened. Then someone tampered with it. Perhaps Mr. Kahn. Possibly, Holmes said, or someone within his circle. Tell me, who else might have had access? There was Otto Drexler, she said hesitantly. He attended rehearsals, though he was no musician. He claimed to study acoustics and often spoke with Kahn about resonance and frequency. I thought it merely critics' talk. Holmes rose and began pacing. Resonance and frequency, words of science, not aesthetics. If Drexler manipulated the score, he might have transformed music into mathematics, a language both deadly and precise. Watson frowned. But to what end? Why murder Sir Alister in such a manner? Because spectacle, my dear Watson, can serve revenge more cruelly than a pistol. Sir Alister's death was theatre. Someone wished to demonstrate genius as much as to destroy life. Miss Varley pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Then I am to blame. It was my music that— Not your music, Holmes interrupted quietly. Only your melody, twisted into another's design. Take heart, Miss Varley. If your name is misused, I shall see it cleared. A knock broke the moment. Lestrade entered, his coat dusted with sleet. I thought I'd find you at your den, Holmes. The yard's got fresh trouble. The critic, Otto Drexler, was found dead this morning in his rooms near Bloomsbury. No sign of struggle. Same as Sir Alister. Doctor says heart failure, but— He grimaced. There's grey dust on his shoes, just like the other. For a heartbeat the room was silent but for the ticking clock. Then Holmes's voice came, cold and certain. The second movement, Watson. The waltz plays on, and the composer, whoever they are, has not yet reached the finale. Holmes was already on his feet before Lestrade had finished speaking, his eyes alight with that fierce spark which to Watson always heralded revelation or danger, and often both. Drexler dead, he murmured. A critic silenced by the same hand that struck down his subject. Curious symmetry, is it not? The artist and the judge both fallen to the same rhythm. Lestrade tugged his gloves off irritably. Curious or not, it's murder, plain and simple. You'll come, I take it? Immediately, said Holmes. He turned to Miss Varley, whose face had drained of all colour. You will remain here, madam. Watson, I trust you to ensure she does not wander. If our culprit believes her a witness, or worse, a liability, she may find herself composing her own requiem. Miss Varley's lips parted as though to protest, but one look at Holmes silenced her. Watson inclined his head gently. You are safe here, Miss Varley. I shall see to it. Holmes swept his coat about him and was gone with Lestrade. The sound of the front door closing echoed like a chord struck on a low organ note. Watson drew the curtains against the morning glare and poured a measure of brandy, which Miss Varley accepted with trembling hands. He speaks as though this killer watches us all, she whispered. Watson smiled faintly. He often assumes the worst. In my experience, it keeps him alive. Meanwhile, Holmes and Lestrade's cab rattled through the ashen slush of Bloomsbury's streets until it stopped before a narrow house whose windows glowed with the dull light of officialdom. The constable on duty saluted. "Upstairs, sir. Dr. Meacham's inside with the body." The room they entered bore the unmistakable scent of scorched fabric and stale tobacco. A piano stood in one corner, the keys spotted with ash as though a grey rain had fallen indoors. Drexler lay slumped beside it, his face peaceful, his hand still gripping a pencil snapped clean in two. Holmes surveyed the scene without a word. Then, stooping, he examined the floor, tracing with his finger the faint outline of what might have been footprints, light, circular impressions made by the settled dust. "He danced," Holmes said softly. "Or tried to. See here, Lestrade, one shuffle, one half-turn, and then collapse." Lestrade scowled. "You mean he followed that same cursed pattern again?" "Not followed, Inspector. Recreated. The ash here is not the same composition as that in Eaton Place. This is fireplace residue, hastily scattered. Drexler attempted to imitate the earlier scene. Why would a man simulate a murder that took his own life?" Watson's absence was felt keenly at such moments, for there was no one to ask the ordinary man's question, no voice to sound Holmes's thoughts aloud. Lestrade filled the silence gruffly. "If you ask me, it's guilt. He kills Sir Alistair, can't stomach the deed, and takes his own life the same way." Holmes's eyes flashed. "And yet no trace of poison, no wound, and no locked door this time. Suicide is a blunt instrument. This is a scalpel's cut." He leaned closer to the piano. "Ah, here, the melody again, the waltz of the Ashen Hour. But note this difference. Drexler played not from the score, but from memory, and yet—" His voice drifted away as he lifted a sheet of music from the stand. On it were strange notations written in red ink, overlaying the printed notes. They resembled mathematical symbols more than musical ones, angles, ratios, and a sequence of letters that might have been coordinates. Holmes's gaze darkened. "It is as I feared. The waltz conceals a cipher, a code in rhythm and rest. Drexler was not merely a critic, he was an interpreter. He solved part of it last night, perhaps too well." Lestrade looked sceptical. "A code hidden in music?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "Do you recall, Inspector, how soldiers once concealed messages in the arrangement of drum beats? Or how the telegraph sings its secrets in dashes and dots? Music is mathematics with a soul. Whoever crafted this waltz wove death and message together." He folded the sheet carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "We must find Khan. He alone stands between the composer and the dead." An hour later, they stood in the gilt-framed lobby of the Adelphi Theatre. The manager's office reeked of cologne and cigar smoke. Victor Khan himself, broad-shouldered and expensively dressed, greeted them with theatrical sorrow. "A tragedy beyond words, Mr. Holmes. Sir Alistair was a man of taste, Drexler a fool. To think they both should perish so suddenly. London loses its culture twice over." Holmes's tone was silk, edged with steel. "You were the link between them, Mr. Khan. The waltz passed through your hands, the rehearsals under your eye, and now both men are dead. A coincidence, perhaps, but I have learned to mistrust coincidences." Khan's eyes flicked nervously. "I merely commission the work. I deliver art, not murder." "Yet you employ copyists, chemists, and stage engineers," Holmes said, stepping closer. "Suppose one of them experimented with a new theatrical effect. Smoke, perhaps, or scent. Something that could turn lethal in confined air. Suppose your financier, Sir Alistair, intended to debut it publicly, and someone feared exposure." Khan hesitated, his confident facade cracking. There was an assistant, a technician, German, like Drexler, worked with stage pyrotechnics. I dismissed him last month for impropriety. Herr Braun, his name was, an eccentric fellow, obsessed with sound vibrations. He claimed he could make music that moved the blood itself. I thought him mad. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Madness and genius are often close neighbours, Mr. Kahn. Give me his address. By dusk, Holmes and Lestrade stood before a cluttered workshop in Lambeth, its windows veiled by soot. Inside, amid the litter of wires, instruments and chemical bottles, stood a single object that seized the detective's attention, a large circular metal frame fitted with thin strings, half harp, half machine. Beneath it, a black scorch mark scarred the floor. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. The Ashen Waltz was born here. Drexler discovered it. Alistair performed it. And Braun, I suspect, intends it to be heard once more. Lestrade rubbed his hands uneasily. You think he's still at large? Holmes's gaze swept the room, pausing on a calendar pinned to the wall. A date had been circled in red, 2 days hence, with a single word scrawled beside it, Requiem. Holmes turned, his expression grim. Not merely at large, Inspector. Preparing for his finale. Holmes stood motionless before the strange contraption, his gloved hand hovering inches from its tarnished frame. The air within the workshop felt thick, as though the very dust carried memory. Lestrade, he murmured, look closely at the pattern of the scorch upon the floor. The centre bears the mark of repeated ignition. This is no ordinary musical experiment. It is a device meant to translate vibration into combustion. Lestrade crouched reluctantly, sniffing the air like a hound uncertain of its trail. Smells like burnt sugar and brass polish. You're telling me this brawn fellow built an instrument that kills people by sound? Not by sound alone, Holmes replied. By frequency, heat, and the manipulation of resonance. Drexler may have grasped part of it before his death, but Braun perfected it here. He straightened and surveyed the shelves. Rows of labelled bottles gleamed dully in the half-light, potassium chlorate, sulphur, powdered magnesium. Each a building block of pyrotechnic art, and, in the wrong hands, the alphabet of murder. He took the science of theatre and turned it inward, Holmes went on, turning applause into annihilation. A paper pinned beside the machine caught his eye. It bore the heading Experiment 3, Harmonic Decay. Beneath it, a sequence of notes was written, matched to mathematical ratios. You see, Lestrade, Holmes said quietly, music is but mathematics made audible. Braun believed he could create frequencies that altered bodily function, the lungs, the heart, even the brain. He failed to find his perfect resonance until Sir Alistair's commission gave him motive and audience. Still doesn't explain the ashes, Lestrade muttered. It does, if you imagine the sound itself producing vibration enough to ignite vapour, Holmes said. Each victim became both performer and sacrifice. The waltz was merely the vessel. A sudden noise, metal striking glass, made both men turn. At the far end of the room, a narrow door quivered slightly on its hinges. Holmes crossed swiftly, revolver drawn. He flung it open. The small courtyard beyond was empty but for footprints in the slush, leading toward a back gate. Fresh ones. Holmes darted forward, his long legs devouring the distance, Lestrade panting behind him. The gate stood ajar, and in the alley beyond the fog thickened like smoke. They followed the prints until they vanished into the main road, where wheels had churned the snow into a black paste. Holmes halted, his breath forming thin clouds. Too late. He knew we would. Come, Lestrade grumbled. You think he was watching the place? Holmes pocketed his revolver. Not watching, listening. If he designed this machine to kill by resonance, he would also design it to detect intrusion. That slight ringing we heard when we entered was no accident. As they returned to the workshop, Holmes's gaze fell upon another sheet pinned near the door. It was a program draft for an upcoming charity performance at the Royal Philharmonic Hall 2 days hence, the same date marked Requiem. "There is our finale," Holmes said grimly. "Braun intends to unveil his creation upon a grander stage." Lestrade stared at the paper. "You mean he's planning a massacre?" "Perhaps not a massacre," Holmes said. "A demonstration. But with such power, demonstration and destruction are merely variations in tempo." They returned to Baker Street well past midnight. Watson, who had been pacing before the fire, turned sharply as they entered. "You look half frozen, Holmes. What have you found?" "Proof," Holmes replied, stripping off his gloves, "that art and madness have become inseparable in this affair. Drexler and Alistair were the overture. Braun is preparing the symphony." Watson frowned. "And Miss Varley?" "She remains innocent, though dangerously entangled. It was her melody he corrupted, not her hand that shaped the weapon. Still, she must not appear at that concert under any circumstance." Holmes sank into his chair, his voice taking on that inward, rapid tone Watson knew well. "We must intercept Braun before his design is set into motion. But first, we must understand the mechanism itself. The key lies in the cipher Drexler uncovered." He drew the folded sheet of music from his coat and spread it across the table. Watson leaned over, watching as Holmes traced the red symbols between the notes. "If my calculations are correct," Holmes said, "each prime number corresponds to a frequency. The first aligns with 440 Hz, the concert pitch for A. Multiply it by each subsequent prime, and you produce harmonic intervals beyond human tolerance. The body cannot endure resonance at such sustained intensity." Watson shuddered. "You mean the waltz itself kills through vibration?" "Exactly so," Holmes murmured. "When combined with Braun's chemical vapors, the music becomes the trigger. Imagine, then, a crowded concert hall, hundreds breathing the same air, while a machine hums beneath the stage. The result would appear as natural collapse, even ecstasy, as if the audience swooned from rapture. But death, Watson, would dance unseen among them." Lestrade, who had been listening with a frown, slapped the table. "Then we arrest him before the concert." "Simple." Holmes smiled thinly. "Were it simple, Inspector, he would not have evaded us tonight. Braun is no ordinary criminal. He is an engineer of illusion. He will not appear at the concert as himself, but as a performer, or worse, as the invisible architect behind the curtain." He rose suddenly, crossing to the window. Outside, the city lay muffled beneath a skin of frost, the gaslights glowing like dying embers. "We shall attend the performance," he said at last. "I will need access to the theatre's lower vaults before the orchestra arrives. Watson, bring your medical instruments. Lestrade, have your men posted at every exit by dusk tomorrow. The moment the conductor raises his baton, I fear the Ashen Waltz will begin again, and this time London itself may be its ballroom." Watson felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the look in Holmes's eyes, an expression that combined fascination with dread, as though he stared not into the fog of Baker Street, but into the heart of something vast, mathematical, and inhuman. The detective's fingers tapped an invisible rhythm on the sill, 3 beats, then 3 again, the pulse of the waltz still echoing in his mind. The following day dawned bleak and pale, the London sky a sheet of dull tin. By late afternoon, the fog had begun to gather again, curling along the streets like slow-moving smoke as carriages rattled through the slush. Holmes had spent the day in restless silence, his violin untouched, his tea gone cold beside untouched papers. Every few moments he would rise, cross to the map of London pinned to the wall, and mark another circle around the district of Westminster, as though drawing a net around an invisible quarry. Watson sat nearby, his medical case packed and ready, though he felt the same growing unease that had haunted him since Holmes had uttered those words. London may be its ballroom. He watched his friend with growing concern. "Holmes," he said at last, "you haven't eaten a thing since morning. If we're to face this man tonight, you must have your strength." Holmes smiled faintly. "My strength lies not in the stomach, my dear fellow, but in the mind. It is thought that sustains me." His tone softened. "And it is dread, Watson, that sustains our adversary. We must reach him before dread turns to disaster." By 7 o'clock they arrived at the Royal Philharmonic Hall. The streets around it were already swelling with the wealthy and fashionable, all eager for the evening's concert, none aware that death might sit among them, quiet and invisible as the notes of a waltz. The lamps above the grand entrance glowed softly through the mist, casting a halo around the arriving guests. Holmes and Watson were met by Lestrade, who had stationed plainclothes men at every door. "The theatre's under guard," the inspector muttered. "No one gets in or out without my word. I've checked the orchestra pit. Nothing unusual." "Then you have checked what you can see," Holmes said curtly. "What matters is what you cannot." He motioned toward the lower levels. "The stage vaults, Inspector, have you examined beneath?" Lestrade frowned. "It's a warren of pipes and storage rooms down there. We've posted 2 men—" "2 men will not suffice if the danger is built into the very walls," Holmes interrupted. "Come, Watson." They descended the narrow staircase into the underbelly of the hall. The air grew colder, tinged with a faint metallic scent. The passageways twisted like arteries beneath the city, lit only by the weak glow of oil lamps. Somewhere above, the orchestra began tuning, the faint hum of strings and horns drifting down like distant thunder. Holmes moved swiftly, his lantern sweeping over crates of scenery, gas pipes, and stacked instruments. At last he stopped before a section of wall where a faint vibration trembled beneath his palm. "Here," he said quietly. "Feel it, Watson. The pulse of machinery." Watson pressed his hand to the stone. Indeed, there was a faint, steady rhythm, too regular to be natural, too subtle to be heard above the noise of the crowd. Holmes crouched, examining a vent that led directly upward toward the stage. "Braun has built his device into the very structure of the theatre. The vibrations will carry through the air and floor alike," Lestrade swore under his breath. "Then we tear the damn thing apart." Holmes shook his head sharply. "Too dangerous. One wrong move could release the compound prematurely. We must find the control mechanism, the key that triggers the resonance." His eyes darted around the chamber, scanning every cable and lever. "Watson, the airflow. Observe how the dust moves toward that alcove." They crossed to a small niche, half hidden by a drape. Within stood a polished console of brass and copper, humming faintly. A thin rod, almost like a conductor's baton, protruded from the top. Beneath it, a series of switches bore markings that corresponded to the same sequence Holmes had found on the coded sheet. 3, 5, 7, 11. "His prime-numbered cadence," Holmes murmured. "The signature of Braun's design. He intends to activate it during the 4th movement, when the orchestra reaches its harmonic peak." Above them, applause erupted as the conductor took the stage. The concert had begun. Holmes's voice became urgent. "We have minutes at most. Lestrade, fetch your men. Seal the exits quietly. Watson, be ready for smoke or gas. Your salts and mask may save us all." He turned back to the console, studying the mechanism. "Braun has built it to respond to frequency, not touch. Only when the orchestra strikes the matching note will it ignite the compound. "And can you disarm it?" Watson asked. Holmes's hands moved rapidly across the dials. "Possibly. The power source lies in this copper coil. If I reverse its polarity, yes, then the vibration should invert the signal." He twisted a wire, his face pale in the lantern light. "It will turn resonance into silence." But before he could complete the adjustment, a shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. A man stepped forward, tall, gaunt, his eyes gleaming with fanatic fire. "Touch that, Mr. Holmes," he said, in a thick German accent, "and you silence not only my music, but history itself." Holmes straightened slowly. "Herr Braun, I presume?" Braun inclined his head with something like courtesy. "You are clever, as they say, but you cannot stop what has already begun. Do you not hear it? The city above, breathing, pulsing, my symphony in motion." "The only symphony you have written," Holmes replied coldly, "is composed of death and vanity." Braun smiled faintly. "Art requires sacrifice." He lifted a small controller from his pocket, its top fitted with a single red switch. "And tonight, London shall remember the name Braun." Watson felt his heart hammering. Holmes did not move, though his voice remained calm. "If you press that, the vibrations will destroy more than your audience. They will bring down this entire hall upon your head. Is that your legacy?" For a fleeting second, something human flickered in Braun's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or pride yielding to reason. But before he could respond, Lestrade's shout echoed through the tunnel. The sound startled Braun. His thumb jerked downward. Holmes lunged. There was a flash, a hiss, and the air filled with the sharp tang of burning metal. The console sparked violently. Holmes wrenched the wire free and the hum ceased, leaving only the distant cry of violins above, a single note trembling in the silence. Braun staggered backward, the controller falling from his hand. The red light dimmed, and for the first time that night, true silence fell. Holmes exhaled, lowering his head. "It is over," he said quietly. Watson knelt beside Braun, who stared at the ceiling with glassy eyes, whispering something faint and broken. Holmes leaned close enough to hear. "They will never understand. The beauty of the ash." Then the inventor's hand fell still. Holmes rose slowly, his face unreadable. Above them, the orchestra had reached its crescendo, unaware that the final note of Braun's requiem had already been played. The following hours passed in a blur of confusion and smoke. The fire from Braun's device had scorched the copper casing, leaving a faint, acrid smell that clung to their coats as they ascended from the underbelly of the theatre. Lestrade barked orders to his men, who swarmed through the corridors, ensuring that no accomplices remained. The concert above continued to its end, blissfully unaware of how close art and annihilation had come to embracing one another beneath their feet. Holmes stood apart from the commotion, one hand resting on the rail of the stair, his gaze distant. Watson, ever attuned to that stillness, recognized it not as calm, but as calculation, the silent aftermath that always followed when Holmes's mind refused to rest, even in triumph. "You've done it," Watson said softly, though the words felt hollow, in the echoing passage. "London is safe. Braun's madness has been stopped." Holmes did not turn. "Safe, yes, but victory, Watson, is a word I hesitate to use." His voice was low, deliberate. Braun was not alone in his obsession. He may have been the architect of this machine, but someone furnished him with opportunity and funds. Watson frowned. "You believe he had a patron?" Holmes inclined his head. "A man like Braun does not find access to the Philharmonic's blueprints or to the finances required for its construction without assistance. There is a shadow still unaccounted for. They left the hall under cover of the dispersing crowd, the fog thicker than ever, muffling the city's heartbeat. Lestrade promised to have the machinery sealed and catalogued at Scotland Yard, though Holmes warned him not to let any technician improve upon the design. Then, with Watson at his side, he returned to Baker Street, the gaslight burning low in the sitting-room as though it too were weary from the night's ordeal. Mrs. Hudson met them at the door, her face pale with worry. "Oh, Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson, there's a lady waiting upstairs. Said you'd sent for her. She's been pacing ever so." Holmes's brows drew together. "A lady?" "Yes, sir, Miss Varley." Watson felt a flicker of surprise. "She's here?" They found Elise Varley standing by the fire, her eyes bright with fear. "I saw the newsboys shouting outside," she began breathlessly. "They said there was a disturbance at the concert. I thought you were there. I had to come." Holmes removed his hat, studying her intently. "You're concerned as you credit, Miss Varley. You may also rest easy. The danger has passed." But her expression did not ease. "You don't understand. There's something I must tell you. Last night, before you found Braun, I received a letter. It was pushed under my door at midnight." She reached into her cloak and handed Holmes a folded sheet of thick paper. The ink was dark and sharp, the script elegant and unhurried. Holmes unfolded it carefully. The waltz was not his alone. There is always another dance. Watch the ashes, they fall where beauty dies. There was no signature. Holmes's eyes hardened. "When did you read this?" "This morning after the police came. I didn't know what it meant, but after the concert, after what I heard, I was terrified it might be connected." Watson exhaled slowly. "Then someone else knew Braun's plan, perhaps even directed it." Holmes turned to the mantel, the letter still in his hand. The firelight played upon his sharp features, throwing deep shadows under his eyes. Braun fancied himself a visionary, but his mind lacked discipline. This letter, however, shows calculation, a literary mind, not a mechanical one. Whoever wrote it sought not only destruction, but meaning in that destruction. Miss Varley's voice trembled. "You think another will take his place?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that someone already has." He took the coded sheet from the desk, the one Drexler had annotated in red. "Observe, Watson, the prime number pattern repeats, but the final line, here, below the 12th bar, changes." Drexler noted it faintly, perhaps not realizing its significance. He dipped his pen in ink and traced the sequence across the page, writing beside it a series of letters. It forms a name, one hidden within the structure itself. Watson leaned forward. "A name?" Holmes nodded grimly. "Victor Khan." For a moment the room seemed to tilt, the discovery hanging between them like the echo of a gunshot. Watson spoke first. "But he hired Braun, financed the waltz, managed the performances. You think he orchestrated the deaths from the beginning?" "I think," Holmes said, "that Braun was but an instrument. Khan's genius lies not in composition, but manipulation. He supplied the means, chose the victims, and allowed Braun to believe himself the conductor of this infernal symphony." Miss Varley clutched the back of a chair. "But why? Sir Alistair was his patron, his benefactor." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And Drexler his enemy, two men who could expose him in different ways. Alistair, through discovery of fraud in financial dealings; Drexler, through criticism of his fabricated discoveries in the arts. Each stood in his path, and each fell to the same performance." He looked at Watson, his eyes blazing now. "Braun was the mask. Khan is the face beneath it." Watson's voice dropped. "Then we must have him arrested before he flees." Holmes shook his head. "Arrest is futile without evidence. Braun's death removes the convenient scapegoat, but it also robs us of testimony. Khan will move carefully now, perhaps even feign mourning for his victims. We must act as the stage demands, by playing our parts." Miss Varley looked up, confusion and fear mingling in her face. "Our parts?" Holmes turned to her. "You, Miss Varley, are the key. Khan will not believe Braun failed entirely. He will expect the work to survive, to be performed again. You must give him that illusion." "You want me to meet him?" she whispered. "Yes," said Holmes. "You will tell him the waltz still exists, that you preserved your original manuscript. Offer him the score, as though seeking protection from scandal. He will take the bait. Vanity will drive him to control the narrative. When he arranges a meeting, Watson and I shall be there first." Lestrade's voice drifted from the doorway, where he had stood listening. "Dangerous game, Holmes, if Khan suspects." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then I will ensure he suspects me and not her. This is no longer a question of deduction, Inspector. It is a duel between composer and conductor, and only one of us knows when the final note will fall." The wind moaned outside, rattling the panes, and for a long moment none of them spoke. Then Holmes folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. "Tomorrow, Miss Varley, you will write to Mr. Khan. Tell him that the waltz he commissioned has not yet reached its last refrain. Let him believe the music lives on, and let us see who dares to dance next." The letter was sent at dawn. Holmes himself dictated its wording, ensuring each phrase carried the precise balance of fear and trust that would appeal to Victor Khan's vanity. Miss Varley signed it with a trembling hand, and by midday a messenger had delivered it to Khan's office at the Adelphi Theatre. Holmes spent the hours that followed pacing the length of Baker Street, smoking steadily, saying little. Watson watched him from his armchair, the unease in his chest tightening with every passing hour. It was close to 4 in the afternoon when a telegram arrived. Holmes tore it open and read silently, a faint glint of satisfaction appearing in his eyes. "As expected," he murmured. "Mr. Khan has replied most graciously. He invites Miss Varley to meet him this evening at 8, to discuss the safeguarding of her composition from the taint of scandal." "How noble of him!" Watson frowned. "And the location?" "His private suite above the theatre. It appears our Mr. Khan has a fondness for staging every act upon the same boards." Holmes crushed the telegram in his hand. "We shall attend half an hour early. Lestrade will cover the rear entrance with 2 men, and I shall occupy the adjacent room before he arrives. Miss Varley's role will be brief and safe. I will see to that." When evening came, the city once again wrapped itself in fog. The glow from the theatre windows bled into the mist like lanterns under water. Miss Varley arrived, dressed in mourning black, her composure fragile but determined. "I shall do as you ask," she whispered to Holmes, "but if he suspects—" Holmes offered her a small reassuring nod. "He will not. Khan's greatest weakness is the belief that he directs every scene. We shall let him enjoy that illusion until the curtain falls." They entered the building by a side door. Holmes's movements were swift and deliberate. He led Watson through the backstage corridors to a narrow stair that rose toward the upper suites. The smell of paint and dust clung to the air. Somewhere below, a pianist rehearsed a fragment of melody. Ironically, one of Miss Varley's earlier works. The sound echoed faintly as they reached the landing. Holmes examined the corridor. "Third door on the left," he said softly. "Khan's suite. The adjoining room shares a thin partition. I shall remain there. Watson, you will accompany Miss Varley until the conversation begins, then withdraw quietly on my signal." Miss Varley swallowed, clutching her small leather folio, the bait that was to draw Khan out. "You'll be near?" "Within arm's reach," Holmes promised. "Trust that I will not let him act before revealing himself." At precisely 8, Victor Khan arrived. The sound of his polished shoes striking the floor was unmistakable, slow, confident, theatrical. Holmes, hidden in the adjacent room, watched through the narrow slit of the partition. Khan entered, tall and immaculately dressed, his gloved hands folded behind his back. He greeted Miss Varley with a smile that never reached his eyes. "My dear Miss Varley," he began smoothly, "what an unpleasant storm of rumours this wretched affair has stirred. You must be exhausted by it all." She inclined her head. "I only wish to see my work preserved. They say terrible things, that my composition killed men. I can bear their pity, but not their lies." "Lies indeed," Khan said softly, stepping closer. "You are a gifted woman, but fragile. You were misled by Brawn, an unbalanced fool. I should have dismissed him sooner. Tell me, did Holmes send you? Or do you come of your own accord?" Her breath caught, and Holmes saw her fingers tighten around the folio. "I came because the manuscript still exists," she said, her voice low. "I feared it might be found and used again. I thought perhaps you could help me destroy it." Khan's smile deepened. "Destroy beauty? No, Miss Varley. That would be a crime far greater than murder. Art transcends its instruments. Brawn may be dust, but his vision remains, and I intend to see it completed." In the other room, Holmes's eyes narrowed. Khan continued, his voice low and fervent. "I refined his design myself. Did he tell you that? I removed the crude mechanics and replaced them with something purer. A waltz is not sound alone. It is rhythm, breath, life itself. Imagine an entire audience lifted beyond the confines of the body, dissolving into harmony. That was his dream, but it will be my triumph." Holmes moved silently toward the door, his revolver ready. But Khan was not yet finished. He stepped closer to Miss Varley, his expression almost tender. "I asked you here not merely to hide the waltz, but to perform it anew. There is another manuscript, one I completed. You, my dear, shall debut it at tomorrow's gala. London will tremble to hear it." "I will do no such thing," she said, drawing back. Khan's tone hardened. "You will, or your refusal will be interpreted as guilt. The public already whispers that you conspired with Brawn. Imagine what they will say if you vanish now." Holmes flung open the door. "An excellent performance, Mr. Khan, but I fear your audience has changed." Khan spun around, his composure fracturing for the first time. "Holmes, you meddlesome!" "Spare the epithets," Holmes said coolly. "Your confession was eloquent enough." He gestured toward the door, where Lestrade appeared with 2 constables. "I believe the curtain has fallen." Khan's gaze darted to the window. For an instant, Watson thought he might surrender. But the gleam in his eyes turned wild. With a sudden motion, he snatched the folio from Miss Varley's hands and tore it open, scattering pages into the air. "You think this ends it?" he shouted. "The music lives in the air now. It can never be stopped." He lunged toward the desk, where a phonograph cylinder waited. Holmes was faster. He caught Khan's wrist, twisting sharply. The man cried out as the cylinder fell and shattered upon the floor. The faint echo of a single haunting note escaped before dying in the silence. Khan sagged against the wall, defeated. Holmes released him and signalled the constables. "Take him, Lestrade. Handle him gently. The man has lived too long in the shadow of his own applause." As they led Khan away, Miss Varley pressed a hand to her throat, trembling. "Is it truly over?" Holmes looked down at the fragments of the phonograph, the broken curls of wax, glinting like ashes. "For now," he said quietly. "But beware, Miss Varley, music is a peculiar creature. Once heard, it never dies completely. Somewhere another will listen, and the rhythm will begin again." He turned to Watson, a faint weariness clouding his eyes. "Come, my dear fellow. The night is long, and the waltz has ended, for this movement at least." The ride back to Baker Street was conducted in silence. London had sunk into a heavy sleep beneath the fog, the carriages gliding like dark phantoms through its muffled streets. Watson sat opposite Holmes, studying his friend's face in the flickering lamplight. The detective's eyes were distant, fixed not on the passing gloom, but on some internal horizon. There was triumph there, yes, but also something else, a shadow of unease that refused to disperse. When they arrived, Holmes made straight for the fireplace. He did not remove his coat, nor reach for his pipe. Instead, he stood with one hand resting against the mantel, his gaze lost in the fire. Watson, weary and sore, poured 2 glasses of brandy and offered one. "You've saved 100 lives tonight," he said quietly. "I'd call that victory, however grim the tune." Holmes accepted the glass absently. "Victory is a word best reserved for battles that end," he said. "This one merely pauses between bars." He took a slow sip. "You saw Khan's eyes at the end. That gleam was not madness alone, it was certainty. He believed his work complete, even as it was destroyed." Watson frowned. "You think he left something behind?" Holmes turned sharply. "My dear Watson, do you suppose a man of Khan's intellect, however twisted, would trust everything to a single manuscript and one phonograph? No. There will be another copy, perhaps several, hidden where the law cannot reach it. And if the formula survives, and so does the threat." He crossed to his desk and retrieved the fragments of the shattered phonograph cylinder which Lestrade's men had gathered earlier. Placing them carefully upon a velvet cloth, he examined them through his lens. "Note this inscription, barely visible under the groove lines." Watson leaned closer, squinting. "It looks like a series of numbers. 14927, then what's that symbol?" "A cipher," Holmes said. "The same hand that etched the red sequence into the score. Khan marked this cylinder as part of a set. There are others." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "And you believe one may still be out there?" Holmes straightened, his expression sharpening into purpose. "Not believe, Watson, I am certain. Khan's vanity demanded preservation. He would not rest content to perish unknown. Somewhere in this city lies the rest of his symphony, waiting to be discovered or performed." At that moment, there was a knock. Mrs. Hudson entered, wringing her hands. "Beg pardon, Mr. Holmes, but there's a gentleman here, insisting upon seeing you. Says it's urgent. A Mr. Harcourt, one of Mr. Khan's clerks." "Show him up," Holmes said. The man who entered looked pale and dishevelled, his gloves damp with fog. "Mr. Holmes, forgive me," he stammered. "I worked for Mr. Khan these last 3 years. When I heard he'd been arrested, I feared the worst. But this morning I found something I think you must see." He produced a small parcel wrapped in waxed paper. Holmes unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a spool of photographic film, narrow and black, along with a folded note written in Khan's hand. "To be opened only upon my death. The final variation will outlive us all." "Where did you find this?" Holmes asked, his tone suddenly taut. "In his desk at the theatre, sir," Harcourt replied. He gave instructions, sealed papers for the bank, others to be burned. This one was hidden behind the drawer. I thought it strange, so I brought it here. Holmes turned the spool in his fingers. Photographic sound! He intended to preserve the waltz not through wax, but light itself, etched onto film. Ingenious. Watson exhaled. "Then the music can still be heard," Holmes finished grimly. "And if one such spool exists, others may follow. He meant his work to outlive him, as he claimed. He dismissed the clerk kindly, promising discretion, and then sat again before the fire. For several minutes he said nothing, only watching the flames curl and shift like thought made visible. At last he spoke. "There is a pattern here, Watson, a final movement we have not yet heard. Khan's accomplice, whoever carried his letters, will know where the rest lies. He could not have hidden it alone while under watch." Watson nodded. "Perhaps one of the theatre's staff?" Holmes's eyes brightened. "Precisely. The same pianist whose rehearsal we heard last night. I recall her name, Miss Celeste Rayner. She was Khan's protégée, devoted, impressionable, and with access to every chamber of that theatre. If anyone holds his secret now, it is she." He rose abruptly, his energy rekindled. "Fetch your coat, Watson. We pay the theatre another visit." They reached the Adelphi near midnight. The great hall was silent now, its lamps dimmed, its stage ghostly beneath a thin layer of dust. A watchman admitted them reluctantly at Holmes's insistence, muttering about restless spirits. The faint echo of footsteps guided them through the corridors until they reached the rehearsal room. There, seated at the grand piano, was a young woman in a dark gown, her fingers resting motionless on the keys. The faintest smile touched her lips as Holmes entered. "I wondered when you would come, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "He said you would follow the music." Holmes approached cautiously. "Miss Rayner, you were close to Victor Khan. Did he leave something with you?" She lifted her eyes, calm and oddly distant. "He left everything with me. His music, his vision. The world mocked him, but I understood. Beauty must consume to exist. It cannot merely be admired. It must transform." Watson took a step forward, but Holmes raised a hand. "And the film, Miss Rayner? Where is it?" She smiled faintly. "Hidden, as he wished. Safe from those who would silence it. I can hear it even now." Her hands descended upon the piano. A low, shuddering chord rolled through the room, followed by another and another, notes that vibrated too deeply for comfort. The air itself seemed to tremble. Holmes moved swiftly. He reached the instrument and slammed the lid shut, the last note dying in a muffled thud. "Enough," he said sharply. "You have no idea what forces you meddle with." She stared at him with sudden fury. "You think you can stop it? The music lives. It breathes through me." Holmes gestured to Lestrade's men waiting at the door. "Then we shall see whether it sings behind bars." As they led her away, her laughter echoed through the corridor, high, lilting, disturbingly melodic. When at last the doors closed, Watson shivered. "Holmes," he said quietly, "tell me it's truly over this time." Holmes's expression softened, but his eyes remained shadowed. "No, Watson. The melody has ceased, but the echo remains. And sometimes," he added, glancing back toward the silent piano, "an echo can be far more dangerous than the sound itself." The following morning, Baker Street felt unusually still. The events of the night had left Watson restless, and though dawn had broken pale and clean over London, an oppressive quiet hung over the sitting-room like a shroud. The remnants of ash still clung faintly to Holmes's sleeves from the theatre, and his violin rested upon the table, untouched, the bow lying across it, as if even music itself feared to disturb the silence. Holmes sat by the window, the newspaper open before him but unread. The headline was brief and matter-of-fact. "Music Hall Arrest. Mysterious Woman Detained." Beneath it, a few lines reported Miss Rayner's confinement at St. Margaret's Asylum under police guard. "The public," Holmes murmured, "will treat her as a curiosity for a week and then forget her entirely, but the true melody of this affair still plays, faintly, beneath the surface." Watson looked up from his notebook, puzzled. You believe there's more? But Khan's dead, Brawn is gone, and his disciple has been taken. Surely that ends it. Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in it. Ends, my dear Watson. Endings are merely the points at which men stop listening. Last night, while you spoke with Lestrade, I examined the theatre's wiring. Do you recall the resonance that shook the air when Miss Rayner struck those chords? Watson nodded grimly. It was like feeling the ground vibrate beneath one's ribs. Precisely, Holmes said, tapping the newspaper absently. Yet the piano itself was not connected to any power source. The vibration came from below, from the same mechanism Brawn constructed, though in altered form. Khan had replaced the explosive core with a harmonic oscillator, less destructive, but capable of transmitting sound through the entire foundation of the hall. Miss Rayner had found a way to activate it. Watson stared. Then it still works? Holmes's tone dropped. It works differently. Khan's design was no longer lethal, it was communicative. The oscillations carry not destruction, but data. I believe he meant the structure itself to preserve the music, his final variation. The theatre, Watson, may have become his vault. A knock interrupted them. Lestrade entered, weary and smelling faintly of tobacco. Morning, gentlemen. The Yards had a devil of a time with that girl, half mad, half visionary, muttering about the Ashen Waltz, as if it were alive. She said something peculiar before we took her to St. Margaret's, claimed that the waltz would speak again when the fog returns. What do you make of that? Holmes's eyes sharpened instantly. The fog, yes. Brawn's experiments relied on atmospheric density. The thicker the air, the more effectively it carried the vibration. Khan understood that as well. If he embedded his recording into the very beams of the theatre, it might only be audible under the same conditions, a fog heavy enough to mimic the pressure of that first night. Lestrade frowned. You're not saying the building itself is humming with ghostly music? Holmes rose briskly. Not ghostly, mechanical. Fetch your hat, Watson. We are going back. By late afternoon, the familiar yellow haze had begun to creep back over the city, wrapping its damp fingers around lampposts and rooftops. The Adelphi loomed ahead like a memory returning from the mist. Inside the hall was empty, save for a caretaker polishing the stage boards. Holmes crossed to the piano and lifted the lid, his expression tight with anticipation. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. At first, Watson heard nothing, but then a faint, trembling murmur, almost imperceptible, like the echo of breath drawn across glass. It deepened, spread, and resolved into something unmistakable. A rhythm, 3 beats, repeating softly. The ghost of a waltz. Lestrade's face went pale. Good Lord, it's playing itself. Holmes's hands moved rapidly over the panels near the floorboards. The oscillators are embedded in the wood. Khan's machine runs on residual energy, stored through inductive coils. This sound, gentlemen, is his last letter to the world. The music grew clearer, the melody delicate and haunting. Watson felt it in his chest rather than heard it, a vibration that made the heart falter. Holmes bent closer, pressing his ear to the wood. There are patterns beneath the notes, he said softly. Listen, not the melody, but the pause between measures. 1, 2, 3, then the silence. That interval corresponds to Morse timing. Khan was encoding words within the rhythm. Lestrade blinked. You mean it's some sort of message? Holmes nodded sharply. Watson, count with me. They knelt, tapping lightly as the melody continued, translating the spaces and durations. Slowly, meaning began to emerge. When Holmes rose, his face was ashen. It reads, I'm not gone, the waltz was never mine. Lestrade swore softly. Not his? Then who? Holmes's voice cut through. He was only the performer, not the composer. Braun created the mechanics, Khan financed the spectacle, but there was another mind that conceived it all, someone who understood both art and science intimately enough to merge them. Watson looked uneasy. You think this person still lives? I think they have never once stepped into the light, Holmes said grimly. Braun, Khan, Rayner, they were each chosen as if to test different stages of a design. And the author watches still. He turned back to the vibrating floor. The message ends with coordinates, a warehouse near the river, dockside wharf. If the source survives, it will be there. Lestrade muttered something about a curse, but Holmes was already moving. Come, Watson, the fog thickens, and somewhere within it, the true composer awaits their final audience. The journey to dockside wharf was swift and silent. The Thames lay shrouded in vapour, its waters whispering against the pylons. The warehouse loomed vast and dark, its windows faintly aglow from within. As they approached, Holmes motioned for quiet. Through a gap in the boards, they saw a figure seated at a table, head bowed over a collection of cylinders and instruments. A lantern burned beside them, casting long shadows that swayed like dancers upon the walls. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. There, Watson, our unseen maestro. He pushed open the door. The hinges gave a low groan, and the figure looked up. A woman, her face thin and pale, her eyes bright as coals. So, she said, her voice calm, almost welcoming. You have followed the echoes, Mr. Holmes. I wondered how long it would take. Holmes stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Then it was you, the mind behind the Ashen Waltz. She smiled faintly. Behind? No, within. Music, Mr. Holmes, is not born, it inhabits. It merely chose the hands it required. Braun built its body, Khan gave it voice. I merely listened. Her hand moved toward the table, where a small device pulsed faintly with blue light. Holmes's revolver was in his hand before the word formed on his lips. No further, madam. She looked up, serene. You cannot stop what has already begun. The waltz has left the instruments. It lives in the air now. Outside, the fog rolled against the broken windows, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic tremor. Watson's heart clenched as the sound grew stronger. 3 beats, then 3 again. The same eternal rhythm. Holmes's eyes flicked to the device. Destroy it, he said quietly. Watson obeyed. One hard blow sent it crashing to the floor, the light extinguishing with a hiss. The sound faltered, then faded into silence. For a long moment, none of them moved. The woman's face was still calm, almost peaceful. You've silenced it, she said softly, but you'll never unhear it. Holmes's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. Perhaps not. But London will sleep tonight without dancing to its tune. Outside, the fog thinned at last, revealing the dim shimmer of the Thames. Holmes turned away, his coat brushing against the dying embers of light. Come, Watson, he murmured. The case is closed, but the echo will haunt us for years to come. The Thames mist had begun to recede when they left Dockside Wharf. Holmes walked ahead in silence, his long coat drawn close against the damp wind, his face set in that familiar expression of deep abstraction. Watson followed a pace behind, his mind reeling from all they had witnessed, the waltz that killed without touch, the minds that bent art into madness, and now the woman who claimed to hear what no human should. The city stirred faintly in the distance, bells marking the hour, as though to remind them that life, ordinary, unmusical life, still endured beyond their strange encounter. By the time they reached Baker Street, dawn had broken again. Mrs. Hudson met them with wide eyes and trembling hands. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, they're saying on the wireless that the fog's lifting across all of London. It's near clear skies this morning. Clear at last." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then the city may breathe again." He removed his coat and sat at the table where the remnants of their earlier investigation still lay, the scorched metronome, the cracked phonograph, the ash that had begun it all. Watson lit the lamp despite the morning light, sensing that his friend had not yet finished speaking. There was a stillness in Holmes now, but not peace. It was the stillness of a man who has reached the end of a pattern, only to glimpse, just beyond it, a deeper one still forming. Watson broke the silence. Was she telling the truth, do you think, that woman, about the waltz living on? Holmes considered this for some moments before answering. "Truth, Watson, is a most elastic term. She believed what she said, and that belief itself grants power to the idea. The waltz was never merely a tune, it was obsession given shape. Each of them heard in it something different. Brawn, the mathematics of death; Khan, the vanity of immortality; and she, the echo of divinity. What unites them is not music, but hunger." Watson leaned forward. "And yet, Holmes, the melody, it was real. We heard it ourselves." "Yes," Holmes admitted, his eyes darkening. "But a reality is no guarantee of meaning. The world is filled with phenomena that simply exist: sound, light, vibration. We, the interpreters, give them purpose. The danger lies not in the thing itself, but in the meaning we assign to it." He paused, glancing at the ashen residue on the table. "I suspect humanity will always find ways to turn its own brilliance into peril." They sat for a while in thoughtful quiet. Then Watson rose, stretched, and went to the window. The fog had indeed lifted, the streets below gleamed wet and clean, and London stirred like a giant roused from uneasy dreams. "Still," he said softly, "there's something poetic in it, don't you think? The waltz that haunted the city dying with the dawn." Holmes allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Poetic, perhaps, but I prefer the tangible to the lyrical, Watson. Poetry makes men see ghosts in science. It was science, after all, that nearly turned London into its own requiem." A knock came at the door. Lestrade entered, looking as though he had not slept either. "Morning, gentlemen. The woman's been taken to an institution in Surrey. Quiet place. She's calm now, though she keeps humming that same rhythm. The doctors say it's harmless." He hesitated, his rough voice softening. "If not for you, Holmes, that tune might have echoed across every hall in the city. The Yard owes you more than thanks." Holmes waved away the compliment. "The Yard owes me only silence on the matter. The less London knows of how close it came to dancing to that infernal music, the better." Lestrade nodded and left without further word. When the door closed, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his gaze falling on the violin resting near the window. After a moment's hesitation, he lifted it, tuned a single string, and drew the bow across it. The note was soft, pure, and hauntingly simple. Watson watched, fascinated. "You play after all that? I should have thought the sound of music would trouble you now." Holmes shook his head gently. "Quite the opposite. Music is innocent, Watson. It is we who corrupt it. A single note, played with intent, can either soothe the mind or shatter it. The waltz we pursued was merely one note taken to its monstrous extreme." He set the violin down again and looked at his friend. "Do you know what struck me most about the woman at the warehouse?" Watson shook his head. "She said she listened. That was all she did. She listened. And in doing so, she allowed madness to compose through her. That, my dear Watson, is the danger of passive genius. It hears too much and questions too little." Watson smiled faintly. "And you, Holmes?" What will you do now that the case is closed?" Holmes's eyes drifted toward the window, where sunlight at last pierced through the morning haze, gilding the street in fragile gold. Closed? Perhaps in the official sense. But as long as men chase perfection through art, as long as they believe beauty lies just beyond reason, there will always be another melody to unmake. He paused, his tone softening. "For now, I think I shall rest, and perhaps play something simpler. Buck, I think, his logic soothes me." As he lifted the violin once more, the first few gentle notes filled the room, measured, clear, untainted by ambition or despair. Watson felt the tension drain from the air, replaced by something pure and profoundly human. When Holmes finally lowered the bow, the silence that followed was warm, not fearful. Watson rose, closing his notebook. "And thus ends the secret of the Ashen Waltz," he murmured. Holmes glanced up, his eyes bright again with quiet amusement. "A fine title, Watson, but perhaps add a footnote, if you please, that the greatest symphonies are not those written in sound, but those prevented in silence." Outside, London's bells began to toll, their rhythm steady and reassuring. The fog was gone, the air clear once more, and as Holmes turned back to the fire, the city seemed, for a little while, to have forgotten the dance that nearly claimed its soul.